Hey guys, tonight we will dive deep into the story of a father whose fate was tightly bound to the extreme rise and fall of the Tudor dynasty, Thomas Boleyn. For many centuries, history and art have portrayed him as a cold-hearted monster, a calculating schemer willing to sacrifice both his two daughters, Mary and Anne, like mere chess pieces in exchange for supreme power and glory. But what if that is only half the truth? A distorted picture. What if the man condemned by the entire world was actually the father who foresaw the lurking danger, and who did everything in his power to prevent his daughter from stepping into that fateful whirlpool with King Henry VIII? Tonight, we will together track down historical evidence, buried for nearly 500 years, to see the real man that was Thomas Boleyn, a talented diplomat, an ambitious father, but also a helpless victim of the very power he craved. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as usual, I'd really love to know where you are listening to this story from. Please comment to tell me the city you are living in and what the local time is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Thomas Boleyn, the man bowed beneath the weight of fate, gazes at his daughter one final time before she is led to execution. Anne Boleyn is still beautiful, still sharp-witted, her dark eyes still alive with intelligence. But in just a few hours, the cold steel of an executioner's foreign sword will end her life. His son George Boleyn, once vibrant, promising and proud, has already been taken from him. They were the two brightest lights of his lineage, and yet he could save neither. This father, who once served loyally at the heart of English power, must now bow before the very man who destroyed his family, King Henry VIII. For over 400 years, books and television shows have painted Thomas Boleyn as a cold, ambitious schemer, a man who pushed not one but two of his daughters into the king's bed in exchange for wealth and status. But what if that portrait, so well known in fiction, distorts the reality? What if Thomas Boleyn, instead of encouraging Anne's rise, had actually warned against her marriage to the king, seeing the danger long before anyone else? Thomas Boleyn was born around the year 1476, or 1477. He was the eldest surviving son of Sir William Boleyn and Lady Margaret Butler herself, the daughter of an Irish noble house. He grew up in a large family, with at least 11 children. 3 of his siblings died young, a grim reminder of the fragility of life in the 15th century. When Thomas married Elizabeth Howard, daughter of the powerful Earl of Surrey, they had little more than hope to sustain them. Years later, in a letter written in 1536, Thomas himself wrote, "When I married, I had only £50 a year to live on for me and my wife, as long as my father lived." £50 even in Tudor times was modest. Yet Elizabeth gave birth to child after child, nearly one every year. Many died. Only 5 names survived into the records. Mary, born around 1499. Anne, born around 1500 or 1501. George, born around 1504. Then 2 boys, Henry and little Thomas, both of whom died young. Their graves are marked only by simple crosses in Kent. Life was difficult. Money was tight. Yet Thomas Boleyn worked tirelessly, not as a brute or a gambler, but as a man of intelligence and ambition. He learned languages. He could read, write, and speak both French and Latin fluently. He knew how to ride, how to carry himself in noble company, and most importantly, he understood one truth of Tudor England. Proximity to the crown was power. In June of 1497, when rebels rose in Cornwall, Thomas rode to fight alongside King Henry VII. It was his first taste of royal service. He wanted more. When his father died in October 1505, Thomas inherited new lands, including Blickling Hall, but it wasn't until the year 1509, when young Henry VIII ascended the throne, that everything began to change. Thomas was knighted as a Knight of the Bath. By the early 1500s, he was entrenched in court life. But the real turning point came not through wealth, but through talent. Thomas proved himself an exceptional diplomat. In 1512, he was sent as ambassador to Margaret of Austria and the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian. He impressed them so deeply that Margaret agreed to take his daughter Anne into her household, one of the most prestigious courts in Europe. This was not the act of a man trading his child for influence, but of a father giving his daughter education, refinement and opportunity. Anne would go on to serve at the French court of Queen Claude. She learned not merely music and dance, but politics, languages, and the subtleties of life among royalty. Meanwhile, Mary Boleyn, her sister, found herself in a far more dangerous position. When whispers began that Mary had drawn the attention of the French king, Thomas quietly called her home around 1519. If Thomas were truly cold and calculating, he would have exploited her French connections. France was stronger than England at the time, but instead, he protected the family's honour. Yet for all his careful planning, all his good intentions, Thomas could not foresee that the real threat would not come from the courts of Europe, but from the throne of his own homeland. King Henry VIII had noticed Mary Boleyn, and the gears of tragedy slowly began to shift. Thomas Boleyn was not born wealthy. He had no vast estates, no ancestral lands, no ancient title to fall back upon, only ambition, intelligence, and the steady determination to climb. Instead of trading his children like chips in a political game, he invested in their futures. While his wife, Elizabeth Howard, endured pregnancy after pregnancy, losing many children to illness, as was common in the early 16th century, Thomas put every surviving child on the path to opportunity. Anne Boleyn, slender, sharp, and alert, was sent first to the court of Margaret of Austria at Mechelen in the Duchy of Burgundy, where she learned the art of diplomacy and the elegance of continental court life. Soon after, she was transferred to the glittering French court of Queen Claude, consort of King Francis I. There, Anne absorbed not just language and etiquette, but philosophy, poetry, and the quiet craft of influence, what it meant to speak softly, yet leave an impression. Her older sister, Mary Boleyn, beautiful, sweet-tempered, stayed behind as one of Queen Claude's attendants. It was at this court of intrigue and splendour that rumours began to spread. Whispered hearsay hinted Mary had caught the eye of King Francis I himself, that she had become his mistress. When the news reached England, Thomas Boleyn did not celebrate or take advantage. Instead, he quietly brought Mary home around the year 1519 or 1520. There were no angry letters, no public scolding, no clamour for profit, only a father preserving what little honour he could for his daughter and his family. If Thomas were truly the unscrupulous villain later dramas made him out to be, this was his golden opportunity. France was more powerful than England at the time. King's favour could make a man's fortune. Yet he pulled Mary away from scandal instead of exploiting it. Thomas was not playing a short game. He was navigating a treacherous world of politics, preserving reputation first, knowing that without that, no favour, royal or otherwise, could be trusted. Meanwhile, Thomas continued climbing the structures of English government, not by seduction or scheming, but through years of dedicated service. By the end of the 15-teens, he had been knighted, appointed ambassador to both France and the Low Countries, named treasurer of the royal household, and made esquire of the body to the king himself, an especially intimate court position. His efforts culminated in one of the longest battles of his life, a legal contest with a distant cousin, Piers Butler, over the rightful inheritance of the Irish earldom of Ormond. Anne Boleyn, slender, sharp, and alert, was sent first to the court of Margaret of Austria at Mechelen in the Duchy of Burgundy, where she learned the art of diplomacy and the elegance of continental court life. Soon after, she was transferred to the glittering French court of Queen Claude, consort of King Francis I. There, Anne absorbed not just language and etiquette, but philosophy, poetry, and the quiet craft of influence, what it meant to speak softly, yet leave an impression. Anne Boleyn, slender, sharp, and alert, was sent first to the court of Margaret of Austria at Mechelen in the Duchy of Burgundy, where she learned the art of diplomacy and the elegance of continental court life. Soon after, she was transferred to the glittering French court of Queen Claude, consort of King Francis I. There, Anne absorbed not just language and etiquette, but philosophy, poetry, and the quiet craft of influence, what it meant to speak softly, yet leave an impression. Mary became the king's mistress. Her husband Carey began receiving grants and royal favours, the usual payments for looking the other way. Thomas Boleyn, contrary to myth, received almost nothing. Instead, he distanced himself from Mary. A surviving letter to Anne indicates his concern for female honour and chastity. He was ashamed, anxious about the family's name. This was not the reaction of a man pleased with political advancement. This was a father caught between court, conscience, and the king, and losing ground on every side. Still, Thomas kept climbing. There was no alternative. The king's moods could end a career in a breath. He pushed forward inch by inch, securing one appointment after another. The title of Lord Rochford was within reach. The earldom of Ormond, too. And then Anne returned to England. No longer merely well-educated, but magnetic. Clever, determined, beautiful, in a quiet, flame-like way that captivated anyone who spoke to her. She was not a pawn. She was not a pawn piece to be moved across some rigid board. She was, though Thomas could not yet see it, a spark. A potential fire in a world soaked with oil. And with that spark, destiny began to shift. In the year 1526, King Henry VIII began to notice Anne Boleyn, a young woman newly returned from the French court, elegant, educated, and possessed of an inner strength that flickered behind every word she spoke. Unlike her sister Mary, once pliant in the king's arms, Anne refused to be seized. And unlike the simplified tales from novels and film, Anne did not enter Henry's world with her father's blessing. Thomas Boleyn, by then, was a seasoned diplomat. He had stood in the courts of Europe, carried messages between kings, and learned to read not just words, but the silent movements of power. And he knew King Henry well, perhaps as well as any man could, apart from the king's closest favourites. Henry was restless, hungry for praise, and dangerously changeable. A man who adored one day and destroyed the next. Thomas had already watched his eldest daughter caught in the king's shadow. Mary Boleyn had been drawn into Henry's bed sometime after her marriage in 1520, and although Mary bore him no acknowledged children, the king's attention brought ruin, not advancement. Her husband was rewarded with small favours. Her reputation, meanwhile, was quietly shredded. By the mid-1520s, Mary was no longer regarded with respect at court. She was a closed scandal, pushed aside for fresher interests. Thomas saw this, saw Mary's shame, and he understood something few around him grasped. If Henry wanted Anne, there would be no stopping him. A king's desire was not a river, it was a flood. And yet, for a time, Thomas tried. He is recorded in dispatches from Eustace Chaput, the imperial ambassador, as resisting Henry's pursuit of Anne. Not just resisting, but actively discouraging. So did Thomas's brother-in-law, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. One report even claims that Thomas pretended to be mad, feigning illness or distraction as a way of avoiding complicity. Chaput's letters preserve this whisper. Anne, angry with her father, is said to have snapped, "I am in better condition than my father would ever have wished." That single fragment, carried across Europe in ink nearly 500 years ago, is astonishing. It shows us that Thomas Boleyn did not in fact push his daughter forward. He tried, however, feebly to hold her back. So why did he eventually support the marriage? Perhaps for the same reason any Tudor father would have: survival. When it became clear that Henry was not seeking a mistress but a wife, Thomas had no choice. Anne refused to be his concubine. She would be his queen, or nothing. And when the king's pursuit turned to obsession, when he began to neglect Queen Catherine of Aragon, Thomas must have realized that no force on earth could divert the royal tide. From that moment forward, Thomas had only one option: to brace himself and help Anne weather the storm she had chosen. He attended ceremonies. He stood beside her during the first public appearances at Greenwich and Westminster. He entered negotiations in Rome, speaking on behalf of the king's case to annul his marriage with Catherine. He listened, perhaps in silence, as courtiers whispered the word divorce, anathema in Catholic Europe. Perhaps in private, Thomas's heart wavered. A father knew what Anne did not. The closer one stood to Henry's favour, the faster one could be burned. But he could not argue with destiny, or with Anne herself. She was determined not to bend, and in that determination rested both her rise and her downfall. Thomas did not become a mastermind. He became a participant, unwilling perhaps, but not inactive. He witnessed Anne's elevation in the year 1533. He escorted her at her coronation. He stood near her on the river procession. He was made Earl of Wiltshire, and soon after, Earl of Ormond. All the rewards of royal favour at last were laid at his feet. But the cost was higher than he could bear. Somewhere in the midst of this golden ascent, perhaps in one quiet moment at Hever Castle, Thomas must have recognised the truth. No one, not even a queen, was safe standing so close to Henry's fire. He had tried to stop it. He had failed. And now, like a father steering a ship he did not control, he could only hold on. The flames were coming. Just not yet. In the year 1533, Anne Boleyn was already pregnant when she and King Henry VIII married in secret. The timing was crucial. The king's annulment from Queen Catherine of Aragon had not yet been finalised, and speculation swirled in hushed tones throughout the courts of Europe. But for Thomas Boleyn, the father who had once tried to resist this match, all that mattered now was one simple truth. His daughter was carrying the future of England. That same year, Thomas's long-dreamed-of ascent reached its height. He was created Earl of Wiltshire and of Ormond, his title in Ireland finally secured after more than 20 years of dispute with Piers Butler. His son, George Boleyn, was made Viscount Rochford. The Boleyns were no longer merely courtiers. They were nobility elevated to heights that even Thomas, in all his ambition, might once have secretly doubted he could ever reach. And then, in September of that year, Queen Anne Boleyn gave birth to her first child, a girl, Princess Elizabeth, born on the 7th day of September, 1533, at Greenwich Palace. She was small, red-haired, and healthy. Not the longed-for boy, but still celebrated at least outwardly. Thomas Boleyn stood near the font at her christening, holding back the quiet fear that every Tudor father knew. Without a son, nothing was secure. Anne's reign as queen began in golden splendour. She appeared beside Henry at public events, guided religious reform, entertained ambassadors, and maintained a glittering court. Thomas dined with the king. He hunted with the king. He swore oaths and watched, always careful, always vigilant. He had seen how quickly favour could fade. His obedience was not rooted in joy, but in fear of the void. Yet beneath this polished surface, cracks already formed. Early in the year 1534, Anne miscarried her second child. Some said it was a boy. Others whispered dark omens that the child was malformed, or that the shock of seeing Henry with Jane Seymour's hand in his had caused the fatal loss. But no account can be fully trusted. Only this is certain. Anne's sorrow was deep, and Henry's disappointment ran deeper. Mary Boleyn, too, once the king's mistress, was cast aside. She had married Sir William Stafford in secret, sometime in 1534. The man was poor, beneath her station. Thomas was furious. The match brought neither alliance nor advantage. He cut her off. His letters to Anne confirm it, cold words about shame and dishonour. Mary, always the quiet one, disappeared from court, slipping into obscurity as the world around her family began to shake. Meanwhile, Henry's wandering eye had found a new target. Jane Seymour, a lady in waiting, pale, seemingly meek, silent where Anne was sharp. The king grew distant. The tables at court shifted, and in the shadows stood Thomas Cromwell, once Thomas Boleyn's protégé. Cromwell had been nothing when Thomas first encountered him. A clerk, a clever servant in Cardinal Wolsey's household. Thomas had known him, spoken to him, perhaps even given him chances. But by 1534, Cromwell was a force unto himself, rising on the king's favour, reshaping England's church and law, and he had no love for Anne. The moment Henry's affection faltered, Cromwell moved swiftly. He had watched Thomas Boleyn's methodical climb. He had studied how the court devoured those who stood too close. Now, he began to set the board. Whispered accusations, quiet alliances, calculated distance. Thomas Boleyn saw it coming. It was not subtle, but he was 55 years old in the year 1536 old by Tudor standards. He was tired, his influence waning. He no longer stood beside Henry at every feast. He retreated more often to Hever Castle. There, in the quiet Kentish countryside, surrounded by memories of his children, Thomas could feel the tide turning and know, helplessly, that he could not turn it back. The wheel of fortune, which had lifted his family so high, now began to grind them beneath its weight. On the 2nd day of May, in the year 1536, a storm swept across England, silent at first, then overwhelming, and in its path, it consumed the house of Boleyn. Anne Boleyn, the Queen of England, once crowned amid golden cheers, was arrested. The charge: adultery, treason, incest, a litany of crimes so vast, so grotesque, that even in the cruel politics of the Tudor court they echoed with disbelief. Alongside her, 5 men were seized courtiers and musicians, poets and gentlemen, men with their own lives, now subsumed into the king's wrath. Among them was George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, Thomas Boleyn's only surviving son. George was accused of incest with his own sister. No credible proof was offered. No witness could recall what crime was being punished. But truth had ceased to matter. Thomas Cromwell had moved. Thomas Boleyn could do nothing. There were no private farewells. No secret messages smuggled into the Tower. No desperate rides to plead mercy. Powerless in a world he once navigated with proud intelligence, Thomas was forbidden from seeing his children one last time. What he must have felt is not recorded. No diary survives. No letter written in the quiet of despair. Only the cold accounts of royal clerks and watching foreign ambassadors. On the 17th day of May, 1536, George was led to Tower Hill. He was 33 years old. Eyewitnesses say he died well brave, clear-voiced, speaking of God's mercy. 2 days later, on the 19th day of May, Anne followed. She was executed within the Tower's walls at Tower Green. She had been offered the sword, a French executioner's blade, thought quicker, cleaner. Anne knelt upright, eyes open, and waited for the blow. It came without warning, silent and sudden, and she was gone. Thomas was not there. We do not know for certain whether he chose not to be, or whether he was forbidden from attending. Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, wrote that Thomas Boleyn was as ready on this judgment day as he had been at the condemnation of the other 4. A dagger-like phrase, often misinterpreted to mean Thomas willingly helped kill his own children. But there is no evidence he sat on their juries. He was not listed among the commissioners during Anne's trial. If he said he was ready, if he whispered any words at all, it was likely the language of survival. To resist would mean death. To grieve openly would mean ruin for the rest of his family. Thomas lost 2 children in the space of 48 hours. Anne, the daughter he had fought to protect, George, the son who was expected to carry the Boleyn inheritance into the next generation. On the 2nd day of June, their cousin and former chief accuser, Thomas Cromwell, was granted the royal office of Lord Privy Seal, the position Thomas himself had once held. Within a year, in the month of April of 1537, Thomas's wife, Elizabeth Howard, died likely of tuberculosis. She was the one who had borne his children, shared his years of ascent, watched their family rise, and then crumble. With her gone, Hever Castle echoed differently. The rooms felt colder. The tapestries hung heavier. Silence settled over the stones like winter frost. Thomas Boleyn was no longer the father of a queen, no longer the head of a rising dynasty. His daughter buried without a tombstone, his son without an heir, his earldom stripped piece by piece. A widower, an aging courtier, and behind every motion, every breath, one hollow truth. All that he had climbed for was gone. Now, at last, all he could do was wait. Wait for death. Wait for history to make its judgment. Wait in the echoing halls of Hever, the only place left that still remembered who he once had been. After Anne and George were executed, Thomas Boleyn did not disappear. He could not. In the golden cage of Henry VIII's court, even grief was not a reason to withdraw. He had to remain visible, useful, silent, a loyal servant even to the man who had shattered his family. He was forced to resign the office of Lord Privy Seal, a position of great influence, charged with overseeing royal documents and government affairs. His replacement was none other than Thomas Cromwell, the man who had built the case against Anne, the architect of George's tragedy. The former clerk who had once served under Cardinal Wolsey and risen by learning how to destroy men more powerful than himself. Cromwell now stepped over the broken remnants of the Boleyn family and claimed the office that had once belonged to Thomas. 2 years later, in the year 1538, the final blow fell. The title Thomas had fought for over 2 decades, Earl of Ormond, was stripped away and legally restored to Piers Butler, his old rival. 2 decades of legal petitions, political favour, and royal grants, erased by a stroke of the king's pen. The title Thomas still held, Earl of Wiltshire, remained, but its meaning was hollow now. His influence at court was gone. The Boleyn name, once whispered with envy and fear, now hung like a warning. No private diary survives, no journal in the margins. Not a single letter of sorrow or despair in Thomas's own hand. Perhaps he burned them, perhaps he never wrote them, but it is hard not to imagine the shape of his thoughts. Here was a man who had stood at the baptism of Princess Mary, the French court of Queen Claude, the coronation of a queen who bore his blood. A man who had walked the halls of Calais and Paris and Rome. Now, he walked the gravel paths along the moats of Hever Castle alone. Anne Boleyn, his second daughter, the one he had sent to Europe with dreams of a world bigger than England, was gone. George Boleyn, his proud, witty son, with whom he once dined at English banquets and foreign councils, was gone. Both executed on Tower Hill, their bodies cut from inheritance, their tombs marked only with stone, their names dragged through court, smeared by crimes no sane mind believed. And what of Mary? Mary, the child he once disowned. The girl he had pushed aside when she married beneath her station. The daughter who once loved a king, then married a man who would never be welcome in royal chambers. She was the only one left. Wordless, distant, surviving somewhere beyond the reach of the court, with children of her own and no titles left. The last Boleyn in body, though never in name. Meanwhile, Cromwell and the king continued to tighten their grip. In the summer of 1536, just weeks after Anne and George's deaths, Thomas was ordered to provide money to support Jane Parker Boleyn, George's widow. Jane, trapped in her own loop of pain and regret, had nowhere to go. Thomas did not want to pay. He could barely afford it. He admitted, in one stark, icy phrase, that his property was much decayed. So too was everything else. His family, his future, his identity. Hever Castle, once a place of music, foreign visitors, summer fruit and children's laughter, now held only memories. Each stone was heavy with silence. He no longer played host to diplomats, no longer rode with the king. The sounds he heard now were the fading footsteps of the past Queen Anne, making her way to the garden, Lady Elizabeth reading a letter by candlelight, George joking by the fire with young courtiers. The house was not haunted by ghosts, only by the grief of a man who had spent his life climbing and was now watching the world fall away beneath him. He aged quickly, withdrawn from court, stripped of power, alone in loss. The Wiltshire title meant nothing. The Boleyn legacy was ashes. And somewhere, behind the cold eyes he showed the world, Thomas must have wondered if it had all been worth it. If any father could bear this kind of price and still breathe. In the autumn of the year 1537, Thomas Boleyn was summoned once more to court. He had not been called for ceremony in many months. His presence no longer essential, his influence no longer desired. Yet for this moment, he was required. Queen Jane Seymour, the king's third wife, the gentle-faced woman who had replaced Anne in Henry's affections, had given birth to a son. The child was named Edward. The christening was held at Hampton Court Palace. Nobles gathered in rich velvet, courtiers in shimmering silks, priests in embroidered cloth of gold. Torches flickered, bells rang. It was a day of triumph, the long-awaited male heir, born on the 12th day of October, 1537. The boy who would become King Edward VI. Thomas Boleyn was there, silent among the lords. He was 61 years old. The wind of royal favour no longer warmed him, but he was still, technically, one of the king's senior kin. And so he stood at the edge of the ceremony, watching. A small girl was brought forward 4 years old, keen-eyed, with auburn hair and a slight solemnity unusual for one so young. Princess Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Thomas's granddaughter. He had not seen her for some time. Her mother was gone, her future uncertain. Yet she walked, head high, as the great silver font was prepared to receive her half-brother. Some men saw only the spectacle. Thomas saw a wound. Here was the heir that Anne had failed to give the king, the child whose birth had doomed her, the prince whose triumph was built upon her bones. And here was Elizabeth, stripped of her title, now merely the Lady Elizabeth by Act of Parliament. Her mother dead, her inheritance stolen, her eyes fixed on the gold and white infant of another woman. Few men in the history of England had attended the christenings of all three of the king's surviving children, Mary in the year 1516, Elizabeth in 1533, and now Edward in 1537. It was almost an honor, or perhaps, for Thomas Boleyn, it was a subtle cruelty. 3 children, 3 births, 3 royal mothers, 1 abandoned, 1 executed, 1 already fading into death. For barely 2 weeks later, on the 24th day of October, Jane Seymour died from childbed fever. She was 28 years old. Her funeral was held at Windsor. A solemn procession, white horses in mourning trappings, black banners fluttering against the grey sky. The Queen lay in state, crowned even in death, and Thomas Boleyn was there once more, not in glory, but in quiet observation. He watched as the court wept and bowed, as priests chanted Latin and a mother's body was lowered into the royal vault. He watched, perhaps, with a mind that wandered backward, to another queen, one whose name was now spoken in whispers, to a trial that had ended in blood, not incense, to a daughter buried without ceremony, her grave unmarked. The world turned. Queens came and went. And Thomas remained a silent figure on the edge of the tapestry, no longer the king's father-in-law, no longer the builder of fortune. He was simply present, like a shadow that refused to vanish, bearing witness to the rise and fall of women he had once called kin. Those around him might have seen only an aging nobleman in mourning colours, but inside, Thomas was already slipping away. He had spent his life in the centre of royal ambition. Now he drifted, worn thin by grief, fading into the corners of a world that had no place for him anymore. A witness, yes, but also a ghost, standing, still breathing, in the ruins of his own dreams. In the years that followed, Thomas Boleyn lived mostly at Hever Castle. What had once been a lively residence, filled with the footsteps of children and the echoes of courtly conversations, became a place of quiet withdrawal. Thomas still appeared at court occasionally. He was present for the New Year's celebrations in the year 1538. But those who saw him would have recognized the truth. The golden age of Thomas Boleyn had passed. The spring of that same year brought another loss. In April of 1538, Elizabeth Howard, Thomas's wife of more than 3 decades, died. The records say little of her passing, but some suspect she succumbed to consumption, what we would now call tuberculosis. She was around 50 years old. Elizabeth had been with Thomas from the beginning, the daughter of the mighty Howard family, who married a man with only £50 a year to his name. The mother of his children, who watched them rise to wealth and dignity, and then fall to ruin and execution. Her death left Thomas truly alone. The one person who shared every turning of the road from ambition to catastrophe was gone. His mother was still alive then, though she had been declared mentally unfit several years before. A strange kindness, perhaps for it spared her the knowledge that her grandchildren had died on the scaffold, their name disgraced. She lived out her final years in quiet unknowing, protected by the fog of age from the storm that had consumed her family. In the year 1539, Thomas sent a New Year's gift to young Prince Edward, the infant heir of King Henry VIII. The gesture was small, but it spoke volumes. For all that had happened, Thomas still fulfilled his duties. He still bowed to the crown, the same crown that had taken his daughter's head and his son's life. This likely cost him something deeper than money. A lifetime of loyalty condensed into one small package, left in the hands of a child who would never remember him. But there was no line left between Thomas and power. He no longer attended council meetings. He no longer negotiated treaties with France or Spain. The days of watching kings sign peace treaties and queens walk the garden paths were gone. Hever Castle became his world, its walls now his silent companions. And in every stone, perhaps, he saw the shadows of those he had loved and lost. On the 12th day of March in the year 1539, according to the modern calendar, 1540, Thomas Boleyn died at Hever Castle. He was around 62 years old. He was buried in the parish church of St. Peter, just a short walk from the castle gates. The tomb is modest, but dignified, engraved with the Boleyn arms, a reminder that the man beneath once stood among the most powerful in Tudor England. That same year, King Henry VIII ordered prayers to be said for Thomas's soul, a gesture neither warm nor cold, lying somewhere between guilt and habit. The king had not forgiven anything, but nor had he forgotten. Thomas's will ensured his mother received an annual pension. Mary Boleyn, the daughter who had outlived her siblings, inherited little at first. But when her grandmother died, Mary received property that left her financially secure. She died in 1543, the last surviving child of Thomas and Elizabeth. The rest of Thomas's estate went to his granddaughter, Lady Elizabeth. Not the eldest, not the legitimate heir, but the little girl with fire in her veins the child Anne had died for. Hever Castle itself was purchased by the crown and granted to Anne of Cleves, the king's fourth wife, in the year 1540. The Boleyn name no longer had sons to carry it. The line ended with George. Yet in a quiet, almost poetic way, Thomas Boleyn did not leave nothing behind, for his granddaughter would rise higher than any of them ever imagined. She would wear a crown, she would rule a nation, she would be called Elizabeth I, and through her, long after his bones had turned to dust beneath the Kentish earth, Thomas Boleyn's legacy lived on. If King Henry VIII had never met Anne Boleyn, then Thomas Boleyn's life would likely be remembered as one of steady accomplishment, not tragedy. He would be seen as a successful Tudor statesman, fluent in French and Latin, skilled in correspondence, trained at court, a man who had walked the diplomatic halls of France, the Low Countries, Germany, and Spain. He would appear in textbooks not as a character in a royal scandal, but as a polished court gentleman, the type who quietly negotiates treaties and retires with honour. He was in so many ways the model Tudor nobleman, educated, hard-working, ambitious, but not outrageously so. He cared about titles and land rights, just like any man of his rank. He manoeuvred through the long family dispute over the earldom of Ormond with tenacity, yes, but not with cruelty. He wrote to advisers, visited court often, bent where he had to and pushed where he could. He was not reckless, not ruthless. He was practical, just ambitious enough to climb, but still within the bounds of what Tudor society viewed as acceptable. In a different world, his legacy would have been modest and respectable. His biggest worries might only have been managing the troublesome whisperings about Mary, his eldest daughter whose choices defied his expectations, or persuading a foreign matchmaker to take Anne seriously as a bride for a continental nobleman. He would have passed on to George, his cultured, lively only son, a comfortable inheritance, perhaps land in Kent or greater control over family estates. He would have arranged advantageous marriages for his daughters and retired to Hever Castle in his old age, a man remembered only for a quiet intelligence and a career of service. But that was not the world he lived in. Because Anne Boleyn, brilliant, spirited, unbending, did not simply want a good marriage, she stepped into the king's gaze and refused to retreat. And Henry VIII, the king accustomed to getting what he wanted, became obsessed. With that moment, everything changed. Thomas Boleyn did not drive her into Henry's arms. Anne chose her path. She refused to be mistress. She demanded a crown. And once the king's desire became a matter of royal policy, once he demanded an annulment, broke with Rome, and declared himself head of the English Church, nothing Thomas could say or do would protect his family from the whirlwind. Yet history is not kind. It remembers Thomas Boleyn primarily as a pushy father, the man who sold his daughters to the king for gain. It forgets the decades of diligent work, the careful diplomacy, the skillful manoeuvring that built his career long before the king ever noticed his children. It forgets that Thomas, by the evidence we have, opposed Henry's pursuit of Anne, even going so far as to feign madness to stall the match. It overlooks that he bore witness to an era when nearly every noble family lost someone to the king's shifting affections and violent paranoia. Most of all, history forgets that Thomas, like many men of his time, had to walk a razor's edge between loyalty to the throne, love for his children, and the instinct to survive. He was not a monster. He was not a saint. He was a father in an impossible world. A world where saying no to the king meant death. A world where his own daughter defied precedent and earned a crown. A world where that same crown cost her her life and dragged her family down behind her. In the end, Thomas was not undone by greed, nor by schemes of his own making, but by forces stronger than any courtier could control, the passions of a king, and the flames of Reformation sweeping through a country dragged from Catholic tradition into political turmoil. He did what countless human beings have done throughout history. He tried to stay upright while the world turned upside down. But in the storm he slipped, and because his name was Boleyn, history has held him under harsh light, not as a man swallowed by that storm, but as if he was the one stirring it. His tragedy was that he could not escape its pull, and so his legacy, Two like Anne's floats, somewhere between reverence and condemnation, between truth and myth. The man who could have been remembered for treaties and royal missions instead became a symbol, a father whose love and ambition were no match for the tide of Henry's desire. In another world, he would have died quietly respected, forgotten, unshaken. But in this world, in the world Anne stepped into, he drowned. History, especially when filtered through modern film and fiction, loves a villain. It is far easier to imagine Thomas Boleyn as a sleek, cold-hearted schemer, a father who hurled both daughters into the king's bed in exchange for power, and then turned his back when the ruin he built finally swallowed them whole. But the surviving evidence letters, diplomatic reports, stray mentions in dusty memoirs, suggest something far more complex. Not a villain, not a hero, but a flawed man caught in a storm he did not command. Thomas Boleyn had his faults. He could be harsh, particularly with his eldest daughter, Mary Boleyn. He cut her from his household when she married beneath her station in 1534, denying her support even after her husband died. He had pride, a pride that could bristle. He once mocked Cardinal Wolsey, calling him butcher's cur, and later delighted in his downfall, arranging entertainments that mocked the former Lord Chancellor's demise. Thomas was not gentle, nor was he saintly. He could savour the victories of court when they belonged to him, and he knew how to wield influence in whispers and gestures. And yet this same man fought, quietly, to prevent the marriage between his daughter Anne and King Henry. Though history celebrates Anne as the flame that set England's religious revolution ablaze, Thomas saw the danger in that fire early on. He tried, as sources claim, to delay the match even to feign madness alongside his brother-in-law, the Duke of Norfolk, in a desperate attempt to keep Anne from becoming queen. He had reason. He watched Mary, his first daughter, be taken as a king's mistress and discarded. He watched monarchs cast aside wives for political convenience, and he had served Henry VIII long enough to see the pattern. Affection could become rejection in a heartbeat. So Thomas did what his time demanded. When resistance failed, he adapted. He accompanied Anne to her coronation in 1533. He spoke for the king during pivotal religious negotiations. He endured humiliation, even travelling to Rome to face the Pope. He sent gifts. He played the courtier, all in the hope, perhaps, of securing Anne's place, and George's, and the future of the Boleyn line. But in the end, he failed. Anne died on the 19th day of May, 1536. George died 2 days earlier. The titles Thomas had fought decades to earn were stripped, his inheritance battered, the Boleyn name poisoned first in court, then in history. He left behind no memoir, no confessional letters. We do not know his final thoughts, but we see shadows of them, cast long across the choices he made in those final years. The way he withdrew into Hever, where memories pressed themselves into every stone. The way he gave nothing to Mary and his, well, not out of spite perhaps, but because the pain between them had grown too deep. The way he left most of what remained to Elizabeth, the granddaughter who bore Anne's eyes, and perhaps her fire too. Tragedy lies not in evil but in powerlessness, in being forced to watch, unable to act, as the people you most want to protect are taken from you. Thomas Boleyn was not the monster the plays make him out to be. He was a father in a treacherous age, too ambitious to walk away, too human to escape the consequences of his ambition. He tried to protect his children and failed. He tried to survive the man who killed them, and succeeded at a price. History has judged him harshly, perhaps rightly, perhaps unfairly. But if we sit with the fragments that remain the gift for Prince Edward, the silence over Mary's exile, the erasure of Ormond from his tombstone, we might see a different picture. An old man in his hall at Hever, listening to the empty echoes of a life once filled with promise. Not a villain, not a hero, just a man who lived in a world too cruel for a father's love to make a difference. And maybe in those last quiet nights, Thomas too wished history would forget him. Then again, perhaps what he truly mourned was that it did not. In May of the year 1536, Thomas Boleyn lost everything that mattered. Anne, his daughter, once Queen of England, was executed on the 19th day of that month. George, his only son, bearing the Boleyn name into the future, was beheaded just 2 days earlier. Their graves were unmarked, their reputation destroyed, and their father, a man who had spent more than 3 decades building alliances, titles, and honor, watched it all crumble in less than 3 weeks. But Thomas did not fall to his knees in grief. He was not allowed to. In Tudor England, defiance led swiftly to the scaffold. Grief was no shield. Silence was survival. So Thomas Boleyn, Earl of Wiltshire, father of a dead queen, did what perhaps no father should ever have to do. He straightened his back, returned to court, bowed before the king who had killed his children, and kept working. That was the most brutal truth of all. How strange it seems, to the modern mind, that the father of Anne Boleyn would remain a loyal servant to Henry VIII. Yet the letters of the time are clear. On the day of Anne's execution, the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuys wrote that Wiltshire was as ready to assist in the judgment as he had been before. Historically, that line has often been taken to mean Thomas participated willingly, even eagerly, in his children's downfall. But the truth is murkier. Chapuys was not present in the room. He relied on second-hand accounts. He had every reason to paint the Boleyns as corrupt and morally bankrupt after all. He served the emperor, whose aunt was Catherine of Aragon, the woman Anne had replaced. It is equally possible, perhaps more so, that Thomas did what any courtier would do in that circumstance. He complied, because the alternative was death. Thomas More had defied the king and been executed. Cardinal Wolsey had faltered in loyalty and died disgraced. The winds of court were cold and sharp, and Thomas knew that to stand still was to be swept away. He was not a hero, he was not a monster. He was a survivor in the narrowest, most bitter sense of the word. We know that he did not attend the trial of Anne or George, nor did he sit on the jury. His absence was not compassion, nor cowardice. It was strategy, a father's helpless gamble to protect what was left of his house. And what was left? Mary, the eldest daughter, the one he had once pushed away. She would outlive him, contrary to all expectation. She would inherit little, but she would survive. Perhaps Thomas found some small comfort in that. Thomas did not speak publicly of his children after their deaths. No letters survive in his own hand, no apology, no confession, no condemnation. Only his actions remain as shadows cast on the ground he withdrew to Hever Castle. He tended to what estates he still controlled, and occasionally he returned to court when summoned. This was not loyalty, it was duty. The kind a man performs when he understands that the king's whims are as inevitable as winter. For Thomas, perhaps the saddest truth was this. He had spent a lifetime serving the English throne not in search of power, but in search of safety. He knew how to win favour. He knew when to speak, when to stay silent, when to bend. But he could not bend far enough to protect his children from the violence of royal desire. Looking back, it becomes clear that Thomas Boleyn lived by a rule that saved his life, but cost him everything else. He bowed, he stepped back, and in doing so, he remained in the world while Anne and George left it. So history asks, was he a villain? Or merely a father trapped in a time when love had no authority against the will of a king? The answer, whispered from the cold walls of Hever Castle, may simply be this. Thomas Boleyn was not the architect of tragedy. He was its last standing witness. Because in the Tudor world, the world of treason, laws, and marriage annulments, of kings who rewrote scripture to suit their desires surviving, was not an act of virtue. It was an act of surrender, and Thomas Boleyn surrendered more than most fathers ever should. The soul of the Tudor dynasty was forged in fire in victories, betrayals, and bloodshed, and so too was the life of Thomas Boleyn. His family rose like a comet across the English court. One daughter crowned queen, another whispered to be the king's mistress, and a son who seemed destined to inherit wealth, titles, and a secure future. Yet by the end, each of these children met a fate that twisted glory into ashes. There was Mary Boleyn, the eldest, the first to enter the king's bed, though no letters survived from her hand to speak of love or resentment. After her affair with Henry ended, she married for love. William Stafford, a soldier of modest means. Thomas could not forgive such a union. He cut her off entirely, refusing her financial support even when she was widowed. She lived in obscurity, watching from afar as history turned her family into a legend of tragedy. No court, no influence, no one to speak her name among the powerful. She was the last of the Boleyn siblings to die, passing quietly in the year 1543, her body buried without ceremony. She left behind two children, Henry and Catherine Carey, whose paternity remains debated. But she carried no titles, no lands, only a trace of her mother's lineage. George Boleyn, the only son, became the shining hope of the Boleyn legacy. He was educated, brilliant, a court poet and diplomat. He was fluent in French, solid in his theology, and skilled in statecraft. When his father was created Earl of Wiltshire in 1529, George became Viscount Rochford, his inheritance nearly secured. But George was not spared. In May of 1536, he was charged alongside his sister Anne with the crime of incest. There was no proof. There was no logic. But the king needed a story, and Cromwell needed scapegoats. So George was condemned, executed on Tower Hill at the age of 31. His wife, Jane Parker Boleyn, a shadowy figure of ambiguous loyalties, lived long enough to later be executed herself for treason. And then there was Anne, the most brilliant, the fiercest light of them all. When she returned from France in the year 1521, she carried with her new languages, courtly grace, and a sharpness of mind rare even among noble women. She refused a king's bed unless it came with a crown. Henry broke with Rome for her. Whole churches were rearranged. A nation was spiritually uprooted because Anne Boleyn stood her ground. Her rise was as swift as her fall. On the 19th day of May, 1536, she knelt on the scaffold within the tower walls and said only, "I pray God save the king." A sword stroke ended her life at 35. Her body lies still beneath the stones of St. Peter ad Vincula, marked only by a simple slab. And what of Thomas Boleyn? What does it mean to be the father of three children who each became trapped in a kingdom's web of sex, power and betrayal? Some might say he gambled and lost, that he traded his daughter's dignity for power. But no parent, even one hardened by ambition, could foresee the depth of Henry's ruthless will. Thomas stood at a crossroads, forced to choose between loyalty to the king, loyalty to his blood, and the primal instinct to survive. To stand against the king was to die. To stand aside was to lose what he cherished most. Perhaps Thomas never had a chance to win at all. He was a man of his time, a courtier navigating the vicious currents of Tudor politics, a father watching children become entangled in dangers he could neither control nor escape. If this was a game, it was one in which every participant bled. By the end, Thomas Boleyn stood alone. No son, no heir, no mention of regret or forgiveness. Only the echoes of names now made myth: Anne, George, Mary, and the cold stone of Hever Castle. Perhaps that is the quiet truth beneath the tales of scheming and scandal. Thomas Boleyn was not the villain of his story. He was simply a man who lived long enough to bury every dream he ever held and yet still kept walking. 218 years after Thomas Boleyn died in the quiet parish church of Hever on the 12th day of March, in the year 1539, the great castle where he once walked still stood. Its moat still cradled the reflections of English skies. Its stones still whispered faint echoes of lost voices. The laughter of children, the anxious footsteps of messengers, the restless pacing of a father who feared for his family's future. But Thomas's greatest legacy did not lie in the estate he fought for. Not in a title wrested from Piers Butler, not in the battered coat of arms on his tomb. It lay in someone much smaller, Elizabeth Tudor, the child he saw only briefly in life, the little girl he watched at the baptism of Prince Edward, her mother dead, her future uncertain, the granddaughter he left his lands to, perhaps because he could not leave them to her mother, perhaps because some instinct told him she might survive. In the year 1558, at the age of 25, Elizabeth became Queen of England. She reigned for 44 years from 1558 until her death in 1603. Her age would later be named after her, the Elizabethan era, a time of arts, exploration, religious settlement, and relative peace. A golden age, rising defiantly from the ruins of civil unrest and religious fracture. What did she inherit from Thomas Boleyn? Perhaps more than we realize. Not the wealth he had little left when he died. Not the titles the earldom of Wiltshire expired with him after one generation. No male heirs survived. But his mind, his way of reading the winds of power, knowing when to speak, when to step back, when to use silence as a shield. His diplomatic instincts, practiced at the courts of Burgundy, France and Spain, later echoed in Elizabeth's careful balancing of Protestantism and monarchical absolutism. His steel quiet, not outwardly fierce like Anne's, but strong in its flexibility. Elizabeth was often described as a woman who knew how to retreat without losing authority, how to bend without breaking. She knew how to stand still when others rushed to war, how to charm and hold at arm's length the kings of Europe, Philip of Spain, Henry of France, without marrying any of them, how to survive without an heir, without a husband, without a single drop of royal blood spilled in her name. Anne Boleyn burned too brightly, too quickly. But Elizabeth, the granddaughter Thomas, saw only through the smoke of loss, survived by learning the art of strategic stillness. Who taught her that? We cannot know for certain. But she had Boleyn blood, and Boleyn instincts. She inherited her wit from Anne. Yes, but her restraint? Her caution? Her ability to carry grief silently and wield power with subtlety? That may have been Thomas's true gift. Imagine that church in Kent, the little one beside Hever, its floor dim with centuries of dust. If the carved stone above Thomas Boleyn's grave could speak just once, perhaps it would say this: I lost my daughter, I lost my son, I lost my place. But in the end, I left behind one who bore my name in secret. And she ruled England longer than any Tudor before her. For the greatest irony of all is that the Boleyns were thought to have been erased, yet Elizabeth, the Boleyn granddaughter, became the very symbol of English power, a queen who reigned through plague, war, scandal, and conspiracy. A sovereign praised for her learning, her composure, her unshakable will. And in her, even if history rarely mentions it, beat the last steady pulse of Thomas Boleyn's legacy. His legacy was not land, nor gold, nor titles. It was a mind built for survival, a quiet mind in a roaring age, a mind that through Elizabeth outlived them all. As the last light slowly fades from the stone corridors of Hever Castle, let us also step gently away from the story of Thomas Boleyn, a father caught between glory and sorrow, between the glitter of the royal court and the cold, creeping shadows that descended upon his life. Imagine for a moment the late-night quiet. Wind rustles beyond the stone windows. An old man sits beside a fire, his hands trembling faintly on his knees. He once stood before kings, once heard music echo beneath vaulted ceilings, once watched his daughter crowned Queen of England, and then that same man watched his most cherished children disappear from this world as quickly as an ink stroke crossed out in a forgotten ledger. Yet through it all, Thomas endured, quietly, still, like a lake without ripples. No cries of anguish, no angry journals. Only an aging father who outlived the storm, though history never recorded the sound of his sighs. This story does not condemn, nor does it glorify. It simply reminds us that in the great moments of history where crowns rise and fall, there are those who pay the price silently. Thomas Boleyn was not a hero. He was not a villain. He was the image of quiet resilience, trying only to survive while the storms of power swallowed everything around him. And from that silence, something still grew. Elizabeth Tudor, the little granddaughter he once held in his arms, whose eyes held both sorrow and fire, became Elizabeth I, the queen who ushered in England's golden age. Perhaps, if we could whisper across time, beneath the marble slab without grand inscription, Thomas might smile faintly and say, I lost everything, and somehow I still won. And now, as the sound of this story softens and fades, allow yourself to sink into rest. Let the flicker of candlelight drift gently away. What we carry from this tale is not only sadness, but a quiet understanding that everyone fights their own silent battles, and sometimes survival itself is a kind of victory. Sleep well, dream deeply, and if you wish to return to more stories like this, secrets, sorrows, whispered lives sunk beneath the page, then click subscribe, so that when night falls again, we may meet once more, just beyond the veil of sleep, under the soft glow of Tudor history. Good night, and until we walk through time together once again.